And so today, as we really jump into the stories, we're looking at the very first story in all of the Bible, and that is the story of creation. The story of creation. Now, whenever I mention creation, I oftentimes get asked the very same questions again and again. If I say, hey, I'm going to talk about creation, the first questions that I typically get from people, and this would be yes from Christians, is, are you a literal six-dayer? Right? Anyone a literal six-dayer? I get asked that oftentimes. Are you a literal six-dayer? Meaning, do you believe that the 6 days, really the seventh being the day of rest, but the 6 days of creation are literal 6 days, 24-hour periods? The second question I oftentimes get asked is, are you a young earther? Young earther. Anyone familiar with young earther? That means that as you follow the generations down from really Adam all the way through, and you count the generations and figure out how things were and how that worked out, that you can say that, okay, the earth itself is about 6,000 years old. Much, much younger than maybe what some scientists might argue that the earth is when it's, 16 or 14 something billion years old, they may say no. I get asked those two questions often. In fact, it's very similar to the questions I get asked whenever we talk about Revelation. Now, if you remember last Sunday, I brought up and said the two books of the Bible that most Christians have their strongest opinions on are Revelation and Genesis. Of course, we decided to walk through both of those this year. But Revelation we walked through, if you can remember, back during Epiphany, January, February. And when I mention Revelation, the first question I typically get asked then by Christians is, are you a premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial? Now, maybe some of these terms you're familiar with, maybe some of these are going over your head, but that's just fine. A lot of Christians wonder those stances when it comes to the book of Revelation. Now, if you can remember back when we covered the book of Revelation earlier this year, I didn't talk about premillennial, postmillennial at all. It didn't even come up once. And in fact, I believe that those questions are the wrong questions to ask. That if you actually understand Revelation for the purpose of the story that it's supposed to teach you, that this question of the millennium actually doesn't matter, and it's not about what the story is actually trying to teach us. And I believe a very similar thing now when we get to Genesis. If you say, are we a literal 6-day church? Are we a young earth church? I would say that we are asking the wrong questions. Not to diminish the way that you think and feel and the way you've been brought up or the books you've read or the sermons you've heard, but I believe earnestly that those are the wrong questions. Is there a way to understand the creation story, that's what we'll look at today, without arguing over the science and the history of it, the literal 6 day or not? I like to think about it this way when it comes to understanding those questions. I did not grow up playing a lot of video games. Maybe you did. I was outside a lot and getting bruised and hurt and playing sports and those type of things. So video games weren't a big part of my life, and really they haven't been that big of a part of my kids' lives now. But just this past year, my kids got a Nintendo Switch, right? One of those switches that you can play here, and it can also be on the TV screen. And one of the games that they play quite often is a game called Mario Kart. Any fans of Mario Kart? Okay, we got some experts out there. My kids beat me in Mario Kart every time. I don't think I've beaten them yet, especially Watts, my youngest. He's only 5 years old, and he somehow zooms past me. I feel like I'm smarter than him and should be able to beat him, but I do not. But as I've been learning Mario Kart, and I'll go in there and we'll play a couple races, and I've learned in Mario Kart there's all these different levels, all these different tracks, if you will. Anyway, give me a nod of the head if at all familiar. Okay, I think Mario Kart is a pretty widely accepted game. They have all these different racetracks, 20, 30, 40, 50, I don't know how many, a lot of different racetracks that you can race on. Now, I know that the purpose of the game of Mario Kart is to win the race. Simple enough. Though that hasn't been that simple for me trying to beat my kids, in fact. But the purpose of the game is to win the race. Now, there's obstacles there, and there's different things you can pick up and throw at others, I found out. Also, when there's a banana there on the road, you can't pick that up and throw it. That's actually there to make you spin out. I've learned that also. So you don't steer for the bananas, but away from the bananas. These are things I'm learning. The purpose of the game is to win the race. But now there's this one level that it's a snow level. There's snow and ice all over the place. And I would say that as we understand Genesis and the story of creation, to debate about young earth or literal 6 days is to debate where this ice level is. Is it in Antarctica? Is it in Alaska? Is it here in Colorado? Is it in the North Pole? And it's a fine debate to have, and you can argue about that thing, but to sit and argue about where this ice level is in Mario Kart is not to understand the whole purpose of the game. And you can argue about it if you like, but that's not the purpose. I think in a similar way, when we argue about literal 6 days, when we argue about young earth, in many ways we've missed the point of the story. And so I want to go ahead and, if I could, as we start this series, just rip off the Band-Aid. Can I just rip off the Band-Aid? You can believe in a literal 6 days or not, and that's okay. You can believe in a young earth that it's 6,000 years old, or you can believe in an earth that's much, much older. Both of those are okay. And there's great, wonderful theories, and there's smarter people than you and I that have great arguments on either side of those discussions. I believe when we instead zoom in and start to argue about those things that we have sadly missed the point. And this was a big part of what we talked about last Sunday leading into this series. We want to understand the purpose of the stories and the purpose of Genesis 1 through 11. And so for today, the purpose of the creation story is to explain God. The purpose of the creation story is to explain God. As we're going to see today, the creation account is written in poetic language, right? Written in poetic language. You're going to hear some phrases that are repeated, right? Not many people nowadays, modern people, are into poetry. If you are into poetry, shout out to you. I think that's great. But many people aren't into poetry, but they are into music. And what I would say is music is really just poetry, disguised with some sounds and music behind it. But music is poetry. And I want you to think about in a song the lines that are repeated most often, kind of the hook of the song. Oftentimes this is the chorus, and it's really what we're supposed to remember, how we are supposed to understand the purpose of the song, what the artist, right, what the writer of this song is really trying to get us to know and remember. And in this poem of Genesis chapter 1, we're going to see some of these lines that are repeated, hopefully, and that it causes us to then remember them. As we read it in a moment, you're going to listen for some poetic language. Essentially, as we learn about God, we're going to better understand ourselves and the world around us. Let me say that again. As we learn about God, as God is explained through this creation account, as we learn about God, we're going to be able to better understand ourselves and the world around us, the earth around us. So are we ready to jump in? Genesis chapter 1. Amen. I got a fist pump. I'll take that. Genesis chapter 1, we're going to divide it into two sections today. We're going to start with verses 1 through 13. It'll take us through day number 3. Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. All right, hopefully as we read through this, you're picking up on some of the poetic language, some of these lines repeated, that God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. We hear that line a few times. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. Hopefully you're hearing some of this poetic language. Now, the Bible opens up with it saying that God created the heavens and the earth. And it was formless, shapeless, right? It said it was without form and void. No shape to it, no form to it. Now, here's a place where there are some theories that come into play, and I want to share a few of those with you this morning. Like I said, it's fun to theorize and talk through, but I want us to also understand the point of this beautiful creation poem that Moses writes us. But some of these theories are out there. I want to share them with you. When we get to Adam and Eve, which that's going to be next Sunday, when God creates humanity, he creates them essentially as adults, or you could say young adults. This is what we kind of assume, that God, when he created Adam and Eve, they weren't little babies, but they were already full grown and they were mature in some way. 20 years old. Think of them as a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, whatever you think is the best age. Let's go with that. They already existed. And so though Adam and Eve were in the appearance of being 30 years old or 20 years old, in fact, they were only a day or 2 or 3 old as God creates them. And so God can create something that looks older and appears to be older than it actually is. And so some have suggested that perhaps God creates the earth that appears that it's much, much older than it actually is, in the same way he's done so with humanity. And so when science says, hey, the earth is 13.4 billion years old, perhaps God created a world that already looked and appeared to be old, though he had just created it. I think that's a pretty fascinating theory. Another theory, of course, as to why the earth is much older is the gap of time between verses 2 and 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was without form and void. And then you get into day 1 with verse number 3. Now, perhaps there was millions and billions of years between verse 2 and verse 3. These are all fascinating things to think about, and I'm happy to have wonderful debates with people that want to talk about them. But again, I want us today and throughout this series to really understand the significant point of the stories, what we can learn and understand about God. So let us get into the things here. Day number 1. When it says that God creates the heavens and the earth, I want you to think this way. Just the other week, our family was going back to school shopping, right? It's like the most fun day of the year, right? That was a joke. It was not the most fun day of the year. But we were out and about, and of course, we ended up in the Lego store. I don't know how we ended up in the Lego store. It did have nothing to do with our back-to-school needs, but there we were in the Lego store in the Park Meadows Mall. Our kids have gotten into Legos recently, and all 4 of them basically love to build things. And one of the things that we purchased just the other day at the Lego store, something that I don't believe we've purchased before, it's one of those bases. You know what I mean? It's usually green, and it's like a big square, and it's just a flat base from which you can build upon. Now, you don't have to have one. You can build other things independent of that base, but that base helps become the table, the base by which you build upon. When it says that God creates the heavens and the earth, I want you to think about God creating the Lego base. All right, if that helps you understand. He creates the Lego base. There's no form to it. There's no shape to it. There's nothing going on. There's no detail. There's no intricacy. There's no order to it, but God creates this to now be able to bring about order, to bring about creation, to give it form and to give it shape. This takes us then into our first 3 days. So on day number 1, it says that God creates light. God creates light, and then he separates the light from the darkness. And then he calls the 2 day and night. So he creates light. Now, what's interesting here is that God has created light, and this is before the sun has been created. I don't know if you've ever read through and noticed this. Okay, God creates the light, but the sun hasn't come yet. That's going to come here in a few days we're going to read about. So the light exists without the sun. How are we in our human minds to understand light apart from the sun? It's really our primary source of light that we know in the universe. In our solar system, at least, is the sun. And what's beautiful here is that God himself creates the actual existence of light. The sun will give off light, but God creates the actual existence of what light itself is. It's hard for our minds to comprehend. The photons that is light that causes our eyes to be able to see. God creates light itself. How are we to understand this? Essentially, it's to say God creates light and not darkness. You notice it said God creates the light. He does not create the darkness. He separates them out and then names them the day and the night. But God creates the light. He creates good. He does not create darkness. He does not create evil. This is the primary point in understanding day number 1. Day number 2, it says that God separates the waters from the sky. Now the word there is in the Hebrew is shamayim. You want to say that together? 1, 2, 3. That was pretty good. Shamayim. It could mean, translated, it could mean heaven or sky. We read heaven in our translation today, but essentially what we're talking about is the sky. God separates the waters from the waters. Remember you read that and you're like, hold on, he's separating the waters from the waters. He puts the expanse in the middle of it. This is the sky as we know it. God creates the sky and the heaven. So the water on the ground, that's familiar to us. That's what we know as the oceans, the seas, the rivers, the lakes, all the water upon the earth. The water above, again, this is how our planet works. Right? Think about the atmosphere and all the moisture and water that it works with, where it evaporates up, it goes into the sky, the waters below and above. God creates this intentionally. We need that moisture above to help us sustain life on this planet. That's not an accident, that's God's intentional creation. But what he creates now on day number 2 essentially is separating it out, and you have the sky and the seas, the sky and the ocean. Day number 3, God separates the land from the water. He separates the waters now even further. So the waters were separated from one another to create the sky and the water, and now the whole earth essentially is water, and he separates that further, and you have the dry land that appears. Right? But what we can see is that the earth is not just this big dirt patch. Right? The earth exists kind of as we understand it today. And as God creates the earth, it says that he fills it in. And you have the mountains and the trees and the beaches and the desert, and you have the little cactus, and you have the plants and the vegetation, and you have all of the things that make up planet Earth as we know it. It's quite beautiful. I don't know if you've ever spent time watching Planet Earth. Any Planet Earth fans that sit in? I love to watch it. I'm the only one in my family that does. But I love to sit and watch Planet Earth. And every time I sit down and watch these documentaries and others that are like it and watch Planet Earth, a few things happen. The first is that my problems, which I've got problems, you've got problems, we all have problems, my issues, my problems, they seem so very small. Looking at this beautiful, massive planet and all the intricacies and how it works. In fact, really it makes all of humanity's problems seem small. And I watch this earth that's working, this earth that is essentially alive. This is not a dead rock upon which God put living creatures. This earth is alive in and of itself. And he creates vegetation, and he creates trees and plants, and you can see the tides as they move in and out, and you see the trees as they grow and they spread in the forest and the movement. You see the permafrost as it expands and then it comes back in season. It's amazing to watch all of the intricacies and beauty of planet Earth itself. The earth is alive, and it's God's beautiful creation. Take humanity out of the whole picture. The earth sustains itself, continues itself as God created it. I love sitting there watching planet Earth. But I love, this is really, the beauty here is God in this day first begins to partner with creation. And what I mean by that is you see what it talks about the plants and the animals, and it goes into great detail to talk about the seeds. Right? We read that several times where it says the seed of the tree and goes with its own kind, and all these details of all the vegetation, the trees, the flowers, the plants with their seeds. God partners with creation itself because he has, God, granted creation the power of creation. Right? A tree doesn't just grow up in and of itself and then there's a tree and maybe it lasts forever, maybe not, but it's just a tree that's there. No, the tree grows up and it has seeds that will fall off the tree, that will bury themselves into the ground, that will get light, that will get water, that will grow up another tree. Vegetation doesn't just exist by itself and grow up and then die, and that's all it is. It spreads itself. It multiplies itself. God has given the very act of creation to creation. They can multiply themselves. This is God already partnering with creation. Before there's even any animals or humans, he's partnering with creation itself for it to multiply upon itself. As a tree grows and the seed falls into the ground, now there's another tree and another. Eventually you have forests, and you have all these beautiful landscapes that we come to understand, these lilies and flowers in the fields and all sorts of amazing things. God has partnered with creation and given it the power of creation. It's quite beautiful to consider. Day number 3 is also, if you notice, you might have heard this, it's the only day where God says it is good twice. Did you catch on that one? This is the only day where God says it is good twice. He separates the waters from the land and says that's good. And then he creates all the vegetation and essentially fills in the earth as we understand it. And he says also it is good. And so in the Jewish world, Tuesday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, the third day, is the day of double blessing. That's why, in fact, many Jews, even still today, will get married on Tuesday. Because Tuesday is the day of double blessing, and why would we not want to get married on the day of double blessing? I found that fascinating. But I think here also there's a little wink to Jesus. Jesus is crucified on a tree, buried, and on the third day, the day of double blessing, on the third day, Jesus is raised from the dead. The double blessing of paying for the penalty of our sin and bestowing upon grace and forgiveness and new life. This day of double blessing that Jesus creates, that Jesus fulfills, that we get to live into eternally. This day of double blessing is a beautiful picture that we see all the way in Genesis chapter 1, winked at, a little hint at of what Jesus brings later on with the third day, the day of double blessing. But let us continue. We've got more to cover. We've been through verse 13. Let's jump now into verse 14 and get our next 3 days, 14 through 25. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. And God said, "Let waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves and which with the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. All right, we're going to pause there. We're halfway through day number 6. What comes next is, if you didn't know this yet, what comes next is humanity. Adam and Eve created after the land animals on day number 6. That, of course, we're going to get to next Sunday. So now we're looking at days 4, 5, and 6. Day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. The sun, the moon, and the stars to rule over the day and over the night. Day number 5, God creates the fish and the birds. The fish and the birds. And then day number 6, God creates all the land animals. And one of the things that we hear, especially with the fish and the birds, and it goes on to say this about the land animals, is once again God partnering with humanity, partnering with creation itself, partnering to say, hey, I'm going to give you the gift, the power of creation, the power of multiplication. And so I want us to think about this, if we could, for a moment in 3 different levels, because I think it's important for us to consider. When God partners with these creatures and with the animals and the plants, with earth itself, to give it the power of creation, the power of multiplication, this is a picture of who God is as he seeks to partner with us. This is an attribute Moses has already been learning about God as he now sits and writes these words down in Genesis 1 through 11, especially today, Genesis chapter 1. And so the plants and animals, they multiply naturally. Right? They multiply naturally. They grow up and on their own, and it's just built into how God made them, and the seeds fall down and they go into the ground and another plant sprouts up. The plants multiply naturally. It's how he's created them to live, to exist. It's what they do. The animals, so now we're talking the fish, the birds, and the land animals. The animals multiply instinctively. Instinctively. God has put it into their DNA, into their brain, into their instincts, and they know that they are to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It's how God created them. There is an intelligent designer that put that into the animal so that they know to come together with their own kind, not with other kinds, but with their own kind, and they know how to multiply. Sometimes you can catch a view of that when you're watching Planet Earth as well, but that's when they come together, they multiply, and animals do it in a variety of ways, from giving live birth to laying eggs. But they do it instinctively. It's part of how they understand their function to live. They instinctually multiply and create more animals. And then the third level is humans, which we'll get to next Sunday. But humanity multiplies intentionally. Plants naturally, animals instinctively, humans intentionally. When a human grows up and gets to be 20 years old, 30 years old, they don't just kind of drop a seed into the ground and then another human grows up and it just happens. No, we do so intentionally. We plan things ahead. Humanity is the one species that is aware that they are aware. Animals are aware, but humans are aware that they are aware. It's God's special design for this apple of His eye creation, which again, we will zoom in and talk about humanity next Sunday with Adam and Eve. But God is all about partnering with His creation, granting them now the power itself of creation as they multiply from plants to animals to humans. And the earth begins to fill in. But what I want us to consider today, if we could, hopefully we were able to see the pattern of creation, the order of which God creates things and the pattern and intentionality that goes into it. Right? On day 1, 2, and 3, God creates the light, in essence, the day and the night. He creates the sky and the waters. And then day 3, He creates the dry land. And then days 4, 5, and 6 coincide perfectly with those first 3 days. So on day 1, God creates the day and the night, right? The light. So on day 4, He creates those things which will inhabit that space. The sun, the moon, and the stars. The sun, the moon, and the stars that it says will rule over the day and the night. So on day 1, He creates the space, and on day 4, He creates that which will fill that space. That pattern continues. On day 2, He creates what? The sky and the oceans. And so on day 5, He creates what? The fish and the birds. The fish and the birds that fill those very spaces He's created. On day 3, He creates the dry land. And so therefore on day 6, He creates now the animals, the land animals, and humans, those things that which live upon the dry land. God is a God of intentionality and order. We're going to get to that point in just a second. But He doesn't do things haphazardly, accidentally. He doesn't create all these land animals and say, oh, whoops, there's no land to put you on. Or create all these sea creatures and say, oh, there's no ocean to put you in. This is very orderly and accurate. And as Moses writes these things down for us to consider, there's no accidents. There's no accidents. God creates things intentionally as He designed them to fit. Day 1 going with day 4, day 2 going with day 5, and day 3 going with day 6. Now, I believe that this has been in the heart of God since the very beginning, that He won't lead you somewhere. He won't put you somewhere that He's not already prepared for you to be. I think that's something important for us to consider today. That God will not place you somewhere that He has not already prepared you to be. He's done so since the very beginning, since creation itself. Everything He creates, He has prepared perfectly the place for those things to inhabit. And for us still today, as we follow Jesus, as we follow God together upon the earth, He will prepare the way for us as He leads us to where we are to go. And yes, it requires great faith, but we can trust knowing that God is the one who's the God of order and intentionality, and He will prepare the way ahead of time. Maybe that's the word that you needed to hear today from creation. But I want to bring things to a close if we could. There's 4 points today that I want us to consider. What are we to learn about these stories, about this creation story, rather than simply arguing about science and history, rather than arguing about literal 6 days, rather than arguing about young earth? What are we to actually learn from this story? As I said, the purpose is to explain God. And as we understand God, we can better understand ourselves and the earth around us. 4 things I want to close with for us to consider. Number 1, and this is what we've just been going over, God is intentional and orderly. Number 1, God is intentional and orderly. Things weren't created randomly or accidentally, which is, again, in contrast to some of these other creation stories and creation myths that existed around Moses' time, where accidents happen and a God sneezes and there's some life that comes from there and it was accidental. There's many stories of accidental creation. Not so with Yahweh. Not so with our one true God that we believe in. Things were created intentional and orderly. You may have heard or noticed a repeated phrase, and that's the word separated. Days 1, 2, and 3, we heard the term separated all 3 days. God creates something and then he separates it out. He creates the light and then he separates it out from the darkness. Right? He creates the light and then he separates it from the darkness. Day 2, he creates the waters and the sky, separating them out, separating the waters from the waters, giving the sky its space. The next day, he separates out the land from the water, day number 3. Separating out, this is God intentionally bringing order to chaos. Right? When the earth was formed, it was without shape. It was void, as it says in verse 2. God brings order to chaos. This is essentially what creation is, bringing order to chaos. And in fact, I just want us to consider something, if I could, for a moment. There are a few stories in the Bible that many people have some struggles with understanding. And I'm not going to tackle all of that today, but I want to just make mention of something. One of those stories is the flood, which we'll in fact look at during the series. Another one is the 10 plagues that God pours out upon Egypt to let the Israelites go. If you look at those two examples in particular, this is God working against creation. It's simply acts of decreation. It's God bringing chaos into order. And so in creation, God separates the waters from the waters and the waters from the dry land, day 2 and 3. When the flood happens and he begins to undo, decreate, he brings the waters back together. This is bringing chaos into order. This is how we understand God's work as humanity has gotten so far off track and he begins to start again. This is a God who usually creates and brings order to chaos. In these instances, these are acts of decreation, bringing chaos to order. The same is true with the 10 plagues. How the animals are mixing up with kinds and they're not working in the direct same way that they're supposed to. It's working backwards. It's bringing chaos to order. This is what God does when he is punishing these people in these early stories. Difficult stories to gather and understand, but I want us to understand the concept that God in those stories is acting in acts of decreation. But as we understand in this story, God is intentional and orderly, number one. Number two, creation is all good. We started to make this point last Sunday in understanding that God is all good, but I want us to see from creation is all good. That Hebrew word there is tov. Tov means good. Let's say that one together on 3. 1, 2, 3. Tov. Creation is tov. Tov meod. Very good. Creation is all good. After each day, hopefully we heard this repeated, after each day God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. There's no evil. God does not create evil. He does not create darkness. He does not create decay. He does not create disease. God creates light. God creates goodness. And all things that are created are good. God's creation is good, fully good. And so a question to consider is, how are we to understand evil? It's hard to look around the world and say that evil doesn't exist. You could certainly say that it does. We see evidences of that around. So how are we to understand the existence of evil? I want to share a philosophical thought with you. In fact, it's one I shared last year during Advent, if you were around last year during Advent. Evil does not have its own ontological being. Evil is not a created thing. Evil exists, but it is not a created thing. I want you to think about it in this way. When I grew up as a young child, I'd go to my grandmother's house often, and she had all these quilts that were hanging all over. There would be some quilts on the wall. She had stands for them. There was all these beautiful quilts. And I learned early on not to mess with those quilts and curl up in them. Those were decoration and for looking at. And they were quite beautiful with beautiful patterns and intricate designs in these beautiful quilts. And if I went up to one of these quilts and took a big knife and just slashed a hole in the middle of a quilt, you would certainly be able to see that slash, that hole. But that slash, that hole, that gap is not something that exists upon its own. It exists within the quilt itself. Creation is good and beautiful. Evil exists as a tear in the goodness of God's creation. How are we to understand evil? It's a tear in the goodness of God's creation. Yes, it has effects. Yes, it messes up creation. Yes, we can see evidences of it, but it does not exist upon its own. Evil exists as a tear in the fabric of God's good creation. Everything God creates. This is important to the story of creation for us understanding the first chapter of Genesis. Everything that God creates is good and beautiful. Everything. In this series, we'll get to evil, we'll get to sin as it enters the story, but it does not exist upon its own. It exists as a tear. And that might help some of us understand the nature of evil today. Number three, God values the physical. God values the physical. Not to say this is greater than the spiritual, but many Christians assume, God is all about the spiritual. But creation, the story itself, is an important lesson to teach us that God values the physical. Oftentimes Christians, both from our past, from 2,000 years ago, and even Christians today, they tend to disregard the physical world as inherently evil or sinful in nature. That everything physical we're trying to get rid of and get away from the physical and blast off out of here to get to heaven to deal with just the spiritual. But everything physical is evil and bad and wrong and sinful. And that's in fact an early heresy in the church, that the physical things, everything itself is evil. God loves and creates the grass and the sand and the oceans and the trees and the mountains and the dirt. He is the God of the physical world, and He loves it. The spiritual does not overshadow the physical. They are intended to work together. And we can think about it in this way. God creates the heavens and the earth, the physical and the spiritual, human space and God's space, that are designed to overlap. And through the introduction of sin and evil into the world, they've gotten pulled apart. But the grand arc of creation of the story is to move from creation to new creation in Revelation, where we're seeking to bring these back together, heaven and earth, the physical and the spiritual. God is the God of the physical, and He loves it, the things that He has created. You and I, the world around us, all the plants and animals and trees and everything we know, this is physical creation, and God is a God of the physical, and He values it. It's good in creation. It's not evil in and of itself. Physical is good. God has created and values the physical. In fact, in our faith, the physical things matter often. We have water for baptism. We have bread and wine for communion. We have food that we are to share with those that are in need. Our faith very much involves the physical. Ultimately, what this means for us is that we, as people of God, are to care and value the earth. Sadly, many Christians disregard the planet and think, well, I'm just a person that cares about spiritual things, and I'm going to blast off out of here to heaven when I die, so who cares about the earth? Let's exploit it. Let's take advantage of it. Let's burn it. Let's litter on it. Who cares? I know many Christians sadly feel that way. And this is to miss out on the original task that God grants to Adam and Eve, which is to be good stewards of the earth, to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, to tend and work the good ground, the earth, the good creation that God has created. We are to, as God does, value the physical world around us, to care for it, to love it, to cherish it, and to steward it well. God values the physical. Number 4, God values rest. Number 4, God values rest. We paused during day 6. I want us to jump ahead if we could real quick to Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 and take a look at day 7. Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God finished His work that He had done. And He rested on the 7th day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. I love thinking about Moses that is writing this account down. And as Moses has been learning and understanding God, he's been understanding and learning Him through conversation and dialogue, but also through the laws that God has been given. And one of these laws that God has given the people that Moses is now living into and enacting is the Sabbath. Right? It's right there in the 10 Commandments. To rest on the 7th day. The Sabbath, to honor and to keep it holy as we understand it. And as Moses reads this and sees this and understands God's valuing this day of rest for the people, he understands that it is God, in fact, who models this in the very beginning with creation. And so on days 1 through 6, God is working and creating. And on day 7, God rests, Sabbaths. Not because God needed it, not because God grows weary, he does not, but because God values rest. And he values how that is then modeled for creation, whom he has chosen to partner with. Like we've already said, he's partnered with creation all the way down to the plants that he's created, the plants and the animals and humanity. God has partnered with us in his creation, and he understands the importance and the value of rest. You know, as the Jews understand their days, right? The Jewish day begins and ends at sundown. All right, maybe you've heard this before. The Jewish day begins and ends at sundown. So for instance, the Sabbath for the Jews begins Friday at sundown and ends Saturday at sundown. That's how they understand their days. And if you really notice, as we read all of these days throughout creation, it says there was evening and there was morning the first day. Now, if I were to just ask you to kind of order the day, most of us would say, well, there's morning and then there's evening. We start with the morning, then we get to the evening. This was backwards the whole time, and maybe you picked up on that or not, but it says there was evening and then there was morning. The day begins with evening and then works its way into the morning. The purpose here for us to understand is that we are designed to work from our rest, not for our rest. We are designed to work from our rest, not for our rest. Yes, we're designed to work with our hands, to do things, to thrive, to care for the world around us, to love our neighbor as ourselves. But we do that from the goodness of rest into then our day. We don't work so that then we can have rest because we need it from working. We're intended to rest first and then move into our work. Again, God's design, even in creation, and as the Jews understood their days, evening and then morning, rest and then work. We work from our rest, not for our rest. And what I love, too, another philosophical thought, there's no end to day 7. All the other days have an ending, moving to the next day. Day 7 is this day that essentially goes on in infinity, goes on in eternity. Meaning for us, as we live in the goodness of God's presence, we are in this perpetual state of rest with God. This beautiful day 7, this Sabbath existence. A wonderful philosophical thought as we bring things to a close today. But I want to close with just really considering one question. Why did God do any of this? Have you ever wondered, why did God create anything at all? Was God needy? Was he lonely? Why did God have to create anything at all? Yes, we're trying to understand how creation works and what it looks like and what it means, but why? Why did God create anything at all? There's an excerpt from one of my favorite books, a pastor and author that I read and listen to often. His name is Brian Zahnd. He's from Missouri, and he's written a book called Water to Wine. And I want to read this excerpt from this book, something that's helped shape me that I believe will speak to you today. Just take a moment and let's listen. The great monotheistic faiths have always answered the question of why is there something instead of nothing in the same way. The only way it can be answered, God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But why? Why did God bother? Why did God create? Why did God say, let there be? The mystics have always given the same answer. Because God is love. Love seeking expression. From what the Cappadocian fathers called the perichoresis, the eternal dance that is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there burst forth an explosion of love. Some call it the Big Bang. Some call it Genesis. If you like, we can call it the genesis of love as light and all that is. What is light? God's love in the form of photons. What is water? A liquid expression of God's love. What is a mountain? God's love in granite, so much older than human sorrow. What is a tree? God's love growing up from the ground. What is a bull moose? God's love sporting spectacular antlers. What is a whale? 50 tons of God's love swimming in the ocean. Why are there light and oceans and trees and moose and whales and every grain of sand? Because God is love. Love that seeks expression in self-giving creativity. Unless we understand this, we will misunderstand everything. And in our misunderstanding, we will harm creation, including our fellow image-bearing sisters and brothers. Existence only makes sense when it is seen through the lens of love. At the beginning of time, there is love. And at the bottom of the universe, there is love. Love requires expression, and God creates all things because God is love. As the Apostle John writes in his letter, 1 John, God is love. And that love is never changing, never diminishing. And the same God that loves you is the same God of love that created all this to express his love. And I pray that for us, as we seek to understand God in this beautiful poetic creation story that Moses gives us, that we understand that God is love. And as he creates all that we encounter, that we would model the love we see from God as we love creation around us. That we understand that God is good and his creation is good. Amen? Amen.